heaven is a song that we can sing, a sacred gift from God. Let's join the
Good morning. So as Neil and Edith so graciously introduced me, I'm Deanna. And it's true, I did grow up just outside of Six Nations community in southern Ontario. I'm from a small town called Smithville. And I think there's a number of interesting things that had to happen for me to grow up in that community. First of all, my great-great-great-great-grandparents decided that they would move from Dumfriesshire, Scotland, over to Canada, to a new world. More recently, I'm a third-generation immigrant to this land from the country of Holland. And perhaps even more fascinatingly, in the 1700s, my great-great-great-great-grandfather Henry, at the age of 17, decided he wanted to escape military service in Holland. And his father was a military officer, and so that was a hard thing to do. He ran away from home and hopped on a boat, took an 8-week voyage across the ocean, and when he arrived just outside New Jersey, what is now New Jersey, he worked off his debt for 2 years and then settled down in the area. When the American Revolution happened, him and his family fled north as Empire Loyalists, which is how my family came to be planted in that area. And so at a time where the Six Nations people were promised a lot of land, it was actually my ancestors who were given over 900 acres of land while they were diminished in size. And that's a tough story. It's a tough story because it's one that we've forgotten. And so growing up close to the Six Nations during times where there was a lot of very heated disputes, at times even violent outbreaks, the story that I heard was often one of hatred and confusion. But as I've come to know my own story, I've realized it's a story that doesn't understand its own story. Once you realize the land that we were given as a gift on behalf, and as that was lost from other hands, you start to realize that you can only be angry at a First Nations community if you don't understand your own story and how you came to be in this place and on that land. And so, while I definitely grew up in that story, I also grew up as the daughter of a farmer and grew very much to love and be shaped by that experience of growing up in nature and in creation. I was a pretty quiet kid with a big imagination, and I suppose some things haven't really changed. And I think probably if I could truthfully tell you, I would say that spending time outside in creation has been one of the most formative things about my own Christian life. Something as simple as playing outside as a kid. Last night, I don't know how many of you were here to hear Adrian Jacobs, but he was speaking about how nature, like the land, is our language. And I thought back to being a kid and playing outside and the language that I would have had then and how maybe that's changed. Even just simple things like spending time with my brothers running through the forest and coming into a clearing where there's like shafts of light piercing through branches overhead. I wish I had a word for that. I probably did when I was a kid. Yeah. Anyway, I would like to start also with a poem. I really love poetry. I might close with one too, we'll see. This one's called The Moment, and then I want to talk a little bit about why I love it so much. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the center of your room, house, half-acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there and say, I own this, is the same moment when the trees unloose their soft arms from around you, the birds take back their language, the cliffs fissure and collapse, the air moves back from you like a wave and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor, time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around. I think those last 3 lines just get me. We never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way around. I think I love it because in this poem, creation has a voice. And it's a poem that reminds me to be aware of, I think, one of the greatest faults of the colonial imagination that has taken hold in this country. The ability to believe that we have a right, or even a God-given mandate, to rule or to own creation as we please. That creation is some voiceless entity that can be owned. It reminds me of how easy it is to move from people with open hands, capable of receiving a gift of creation, and its ability to interact, to teach, to feed us, to move into something where we are clutching a gift so tightly that we squeeze the life right out of it. It also, I guess, reminds me of a harmful worldview that has birthed deep brokenness that exists between us as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And I think relearning my people's story in light of the stories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations has helped me to see that not only have we stopped listening to creation, but sometimes we're equally as guilty as not listening to our own stories. And I think the last reason I really like this poem is that it touches on something that the Old Testament also talks about. The scholar Walter Brueggemann suggests that we face a similar issue here in our own context as the nation of Israel did, a nation of 12 tribes who held their story tightly. But Israel's promised land soon turned to problem land, and they are exiled. And so too must we struggle to understand how we live in landed but gifted realities. And so I guess first I'd like to just bring us, if you have the sheet of paper with the scriptures on it that Melanie was talking about, the third one down is a passage from Genesis 9, and it talks about Noah. And I think as I've learned to listen to the voice that creation has and learned from my Indigenous friends, I was struck at how reading through our biblical text has changed for me. It's exciting in a new way because suddenly there's this voice of creation within it that I've never heard or noticed before. And so this is one striking passage. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth." So the covenant isn't just between humanity, it's between humanity and the earth and God. Looking at the passage of how Israel is wandering in the Exodus story through the wilderness, this idea of inheritance, of a promised land, there's a Hebrew word called nehelah. And this word has been so fascinating for me this year as I've been studying. So some scholars would say that it's a word that means like inheritance, but there's another scholar named Norman Habel who suggests that actually a better definition is that it's a portion or a share, an entitlement, like to a share of land for living on. And in this case, the word nehelah also holds a legal concept, and the biblical narrative witnesses to land, particularly Canaan, but not limited to Canaan, as Yahweh's personal nehelah, his personal share. And so out of the overflow of God's personal share, he shares a piece with Israel. And I just love that because I think it also witnesses to a beautifully triangulated relationship between Yahweh, land, and people that's expressed in this concept of nehelah. They are like destined to belong together. They're united in privileged intimacy. The land of Canaan and the people of Israel are Yahweh's share. And I can't help but draw similar, I can't help but also see that in the stories of my Indigenous friends, they would also tell you that the Creator gave them a share and that it was their job to care for this share that they have been given. And it raises a lot of really beautiful but interesting questions for me, especially as I come to understand story as something that is used to teach important lessons. A treaty, a covenant treaty that addresses how to care for the land, which is a gift from the Creator. It just sounds also fascinatingly familiar from the stories of my Indigenous friends. I think the last thing I'd like to talk about a little bit is I'd like to look at the concept of reconciliation, but through the lens of God's nehelah. And so his intended and sought after relationship between God, land, and people. And I can just see it like in the text now. Sorry. that it's like God is trying to teach Israel how to live in this land. And sometimes I read that story about them wandering in the wilderness, and I think, that's kind of a little cruel. Like, you pull these people out of slavery, and then you make them wander around the desert for 40 years. Like, it kind of just seems a little silly. But then as I started to think about it, you realize, like, he's actually trying to teach them something vitally important that they needed to know before they entered any kind of promised land. He's trying to teach them who he is and who he is in the land. And to me, that's just a very beautiful articulation of also something that God wants to teach us. So the concept of reconciliation, in the Greek, like, it might mean like a change or an alternation of relations between individuals or persons. And I'd like us to extend that idea to also think about a change or alteration of our relationships to creation. This word in the Greek is kataliso, and it also holds an economic meaning. And so as I reflect back also on the Old Testament story about notions of Jubilee and Sabbath, these things also included rest for the land. They included rest for humanity, the release of bondage and debt, but also the release of the land to be free to rest and to heal. And so, like, I think to me it just has been something in this last year that has really pushed me to see that the Old Testament text really is talking about shalom. It's talking about harmony. And these are things and challenges that we have to deal with also in our own confrontations of what the land is and what it means to us. The last thing I wanted to say about reconciliation, I took an interesting class this year. I'm saying interesting because I see my professor sitting here, so working on brownie points. And one of the things this class did for me was really change a huge understanding for me of what reconciliation means, because my professor took this word status, and when I look at verses that say, like, from now on, therefore, we regard no one from a human point of view. Even though we once knew Christ from a human point of view, we know him no longer in that way. And really, I think my professor just brought to life for me how what Jesus did was usher in a new creation. And in this new creation, I can no longer view you from your human status, because you are a new creation in this body. So whether you're Aboriginal, whether you're Jew, whether you're Greek, whether you're Dutch, whether you're Scottish, we are part of this new humanity. But I'd like to extend this also to how we view creation. I think that instead of referring to, like, the socially conditioned worldview that we inherit about what creation is, especially amidst a culture that really has not understood how to live within creation wisely, and that we're now feeling the repercussions of so deeply and boldly, what we really do need is to rethink these conventions that have defined what it means to view creation. And so Paul actually talks about a rupture, a change taking place in his way of knowing. And I think that's what needs to happen with our way of knowing creation. And I think that's why I have been so profoundly blessed in my friendships with Indigenous people, because they have helped me change and start a journey about how I know creation. I think that Indigenous people have a profound voice that is so greatly needed in the church today, precisely because they have learned to listen to the voice of the land. Again, as Adrian was speaking last night and talking about the stories of the land, I was struck thinking about how Canada really faces interesting challenges because we're a nation with hundreds of stories of lands from far, far away. And I think somehow we need to learn how to tell our stories of those homelands while also learning the story of this land. And I think that when I look at how wide Christ's reconciliation is to include all of creation, those are the stories that we need to learn. And I need my Indigenous neighbors to teach them to me. So I would like to say thank you for all the people who have taught me to start this journey. I think as we learn to move into new paradigms of what reconciliation looks like in this country and on this land, learning to hear the stories that they know about the land will be pivotal. I'd like to close with a poem. It doesn't have a title. It seems to me still hard to explain how the true nature of something all around us surrounds us and yet eludes us still. Take until food beyond our fill, training young up in this drill. For whatever it is you will, the world is yours to kill, and that is just an ordinary hill. We'll take the check and leave you the bill. All the while I wonder if we might again be still. Still enough to listen, still enough to learn, from voices all around us that have surrounded us and yet elude us still. Creator, teach us to rub the earth between our fingers and have the patience to yearn for a gentleness that outgrows machinery tracks as we ponder life's squander in this race for dollar backs, for a quietness amidst the richness of creation that realizes the poverty of enlistening ears. Hear the dominant consciousness, always that we may forget the giftedness of life, our trampling without regret. Clenching land as promise turns it to problem in our grasp. Loosen our hand, relinquish our clasp. Creator, meet us in hope, here amidst the rift. Guide our way to knowing with one another, your land is a gift. Thank you.
A sacred